Hello, everyone, and welcome. As folks are filtering in, please feel free to drop your name and where you're joining from or what organization you represent into the chat, and we will go ahead and get started in just a couple minutes. So great to see so many friends, old and new. For those of us on the East Coast like me, I have 3 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Kunis, and I am the Executive Director at VoteRiders. Thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon on the SAVE Act and Proof of Citizenship laws, what's next, and what you need to know. It is great to see over 200 of you coming in. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. First, please put all questions for our panelists into the Q&A. This will help us ensure we can get to all of them. Secondly, and I saw a couple questions in the chat on this already, the slide deck recording and all the links that we mentioned will be shared via a follow-up email in the coming days, rest assured. Last but not least, we want to thank our partners at the American Association of People with Disabilities, or AAPD's Rev Up program, who have generously provided us with CART captioning for today's event. You can view CART captions by clicking the CC button on your bottom toolbar. If you prefer to view the captions in another window, we'll put the link in the chat. Our interpreter today is LaDonna Gabrielson. Welcome, LaDonna. We're using the spotlight feature so everyone can see her. So, all right, with no further ado, we have got a lot to cover today. So let's get going and go to the first slide. Today, you will first hear from VoteRiders Legal Director Caridwen Cherry and National Outreach Director Selene Gomez. They will walk you through the basics of proof of citizenship legislation, what such bills could mean for eligible voters, and share research findings on who lacks easy access to the type of documents that would be required to vote under the SAVE Act and similar state-level legislation. To dive into the SAVE Act's implications for voter registration, we are joined by Jessica Jones-Caparel, Director of Government Affairs at the League of Women Voters of the United States. Next, we'll have Sarah Gonski, Senior Policy Advisor at the Institute for Responsive Government, who will walk us through what the SAVE Act could mean for election officials across the country if enacted. Last but not least, we'll share some easy and impactful ways to take action and open up the floor for questions. So going on to the next slide, VoteRiders is a national voting rights organization that since 2012 has focused on voter ID issues. We provide voters with information and free one-on-one ID assistance to ensure broad and equitable ballot access, while also conducting research and advocacy in service of our mission. On the next slide, our work at VoteRiders has never been more needed. And this map gives you an illustration as to why that is. 38 states, more than ever before in our country's history, have voter ID laws in place today. Since the 2020 elections alone, 18 states have put in place new or even stricter voter ID laws, impacting the way that tens of millions of citizens cast their ballots in person and by mail. The landscape is rapidly changing, with several concerning trends emerging that we'll go into on the next slide. So recent trends have included new photo ID laws, which remove some of the non-photo options, such as a utility bill that many voters previously depended upon. We've also increasingly seen student IDs removed as accepted forms of ID at the polls. In response to misleading narratives around mail-in voting during the 2020 election in particular, in 2021 and 22, we saw scores of laws enacted that added new ID requirements for mail-in voting. Most concerning, and what we are here to talk about today, is the growing push for documentary proof of citizenship just to register to vote. These requirements would create significant barriers for eligible voters, particularly those from underrepresented communities, but really spanning across all demographics, geographies, political affiliations, and more. The rules that are being established now, today, up for debate in Congress and state legislatures, will determine who can participate in upcoming elections, how we vote, when we vote, and importantly, if we can vote at all. So with that, I will turn you over to our legal director, Caridwin Cherry, who will examine these proof of citizenship requirements in greater detail.
I think I was muted. Hi, I am Caridwin Cherry. I am the legal director at VoteRiders, and I am absolutely thrilled to see so many of you here. I'm going to begin by giving a little background on what proof of citizenship laws are, and then we're going to talk in more detail about the SAVE Act. So what is proof of citizenship, or what we often call documentary proof of citizenship, or the fun acronym DPOC? Lauren just outlined a number of voter ID laws, which is what VoteRiders has specialized in throughout our history. And voter ID laws are laws that require when you go to vote, or maybe sometimes when you send in your mail ballot, you have to provide some type of identification. That's an every time you vote kind of requirement. Proof of citizenship laws are aimed at registration, and they're a one-off requirement. So at the time you register, or perhaps the time you update your registration, you have to provide proof that you are a US citizen. What does that look like? It really varies on what the actual law requires, and we're going to get into some detail on that. I'm going to also talk about the history of DPOC laws, kind of see where we're at with that and where the SAVE Act fits in that context. And then talk more about the SAVE Act and some of the state DPOC laws that we're looking at too. Next slide, please. So the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act is an act in Congress. It was introduced in the last Congress, and it did pass the House there. It has been reintroduced again here, and we expect that it may be up for vote in the House as soon as next week. The SAVE Act requires that every American would have to show proof of citizenship in person, and we'll get into that in more detail, to register to vote or to re-register to vote. So if you need to update your voter registration for some reason, to change your party affiliation, if you move, if you needed to change your name on your voter registration. This is going to create an unnecessary barrier for tens of millions of eligible voters, and Selene is going to get into that in more detail about who exactly is going to be most impacted. One of the concerns about the SAVE Act is that voters already affirm their US citizenship at the time that they register to vote in a federal election. When you fill out the voter registration form, generally you have to check a box that says, are you a US citizen? You sign it with your name, and you're affirming it under legal penalties. So the SAVE Act is really unnecessary. Everybody who's voting in our federal elections has already confirmed that they are a US citizen. The SAVE Act will apply to all forms of voter registration. If you register in person, online, by mail, at the DMV, at a public assistance agency, or through a third-party voter registration. For example, if you are run into our friends at the League of Women Voters and they help you register on the street, that would be impacted too. There's no cure period under the SAVE Act. So that means if you go to register and you don't have your proof of citizenship with you in your hand at the time, there's no opportunity to fix it later. You can't submit your voter registration and then say, I'll come back tomorrow with it. You will be rejected on the spot. Next slide, please. So what are the types of proof of citizenship that are acceptable under the SAVE Act? So I have to admit, when I first looked at the text of the SAVE Act, my first thought was, this is a pretty long list of IDs. I'm used to some of the voter ID state laws in other states where they're pretty short. And my first instinct was, this is not a bad list. But then I started to dig into it, and it is really problematic. So the first category that is listed in the bill is Real ID. As many of you may know, the Real ID law is going to go into effect finally. It's been kind of pushed off and pushed off for years. Later this year, it's a type of sort of heightened ID that many driver's licenses and state IDs have. And the SAVE Act lists Real ID as a type of acceptable ID. The problem with that is it says the Real ID has to indicate your US citizenship. And it turns out that of all the states who are issuing Real IDs, only 5 issue a real ID that actually indicates your US citizenship. And so for most people, that automatically rules out their driver's license or their photo ID, even if they had to prove US citizenship to get that license. If it doesn't say it on the face of it, if it's not from one of those 5 states, that's not going to work. Obviously, we have a US passport, although there are challenges to getting those, especially the cost, a US military ID, but it also needs to come with your military service record showing your place of birth in the US. A photo from a federal, state, or tribal government that shows place of birth in the US. Again, my first instinct here was, well, at least it includes tribal government or tribal IDs. But when I talked to partners who work in the Native American voting rights space with our teams on the ground, we realized there's not a single tribal government in the US right now that issues a type of ID that shows your place of birth. So that means all tribal IDs automatically do not qualify under the SAVE Act. The next category is you could show a photo ID that doesn't show your place of birth. So maybe you've got your driver's license, it doesn't show your place of birth, but then you need to show another document. So something like a certified US birth certificate, your naturalization certificate, an adoption certificate, a US certificate of birth abroad. Now, we know from our work at VoteRiders that getting those documents for many voters is extremely challenging. And Selene is going to talk more about who in particular lacks those types of documents, but they can be costly to get. And for example, a certified US birth certificate, I was thinking about it today. I think I was well into my adult life before I had a certified copy of my birth certificate. I think I had a photocopy. And even before that, I don't think I had a copy at all. So it's pretty common that people don't have access to these documents. The final part of the bill that is really concerning is there's this very vague provision in it that says, well, if a voter can't meet these requirements, that's fine. The state election official can just decide how to ascertain citizenship. And you could put in some other evidence, but it's not clear what that other evidence would be. I'm sure many of you have heard the concern that many people who have changed their name, which typically impacts women who have changed their name at marriage, although about 5% of men change their name at marriage too. And there are obviously a lot of other reasons why people change their name over the course of their life, may have a birth certificate without their current legal name on it. And it is not clear on the face of the SAVE Act if you could provide other evidence to fit that. So for example, could you bring your birth certificate and then a marriage certificate? Or really what other evidence would be accepted. At VoteRiders, we're very concerned about this being left up to state election officials. We know that when we let states interpret their own voter ID laws, they often do so in the strictest way possible. And so we're concerned about people who would be left out under such a requirement. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, the SAVE Act is not the only proof of citizenship bill pending right now. In addition to SAVE, which is happening at the federal level, there are a number of proof of citizenship laws in varying states around the country. So proof of citizenship is a pretty new circumstance in the voting rights space. The first proof of citizenship law was in Arizona in 2004. And after that, it was quite a while for the next one, Kansas in 2011. And last year, both New Hampshire and Louisiana passed proof of citizenship laws. So we are seeing a bit of an uptick here. In 2025 alone, there are at least 19 states that have a pending proof of citizenship law. I think it's really important to look at the experience of proof of citizenship in the states to have a sense of what these bills in other states are going to look like, but also what the potential impact for SAVE would be. The experience in Arizona with proof of citizenship has been very complicated. My colleague Sarah, who's here, is in Arizona. I know she can speak to that. There have been years of litigation involving that law, and it has currently results in a very complicated two-tiered registration system where voters have different requirements for what they need to show to register for state and federal elections, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is unbelievably complicated. As a result, there are tens of thousands of voters in Arizona who cannot participate in state elections because they have not provided the proof of citizenship that Arizona requires. In Kansas, in the period of time in which that law was in effect, over 30,000 voters were prevented from registering to vote due to a lack of proof of citizenship. About 12% of all voters who tried to register in Kansas were turned away because of lack of proof of citizenship. That law was struck down in litigation, and so it's currently not in place. When we look at the DPOC bills that are pending right now, they really vary in terms of what's in them, the type of DPOC that they would accept, how much discretion election officials might have over what they could accept, how vague that sort of term in similar to SAVE is. And then whether or not they would mandate some kind of ongoing voter roll purges, whether they're using citizenship data, which is often outdated, to check the voter rolls and then kick people off them. What we do know from looking at these state bills is if we were to kind of put them all on a spectrum, SAVE would be all the way to one end. It is the most extreme of the bills pending right now, which is especially concerning because it's at the federal level. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Selene, who can share more about who is going to be impacted by these bills if they were to go into effect.
Thank you. So now that we've talked about voter ID and documentary proof of citizenship and what that means, we're going to talk about some of the research findings. We did a study along with the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement from the University of Maryland and the Brennan Center for Justice. We did the first one that was a national representation of the survey in late 2023. And then we did a state-specific survey for Texas and for Georgia in 2024. So these are going to be the numbers that we're going to be going over. So in this next slide, you can see that when it comes to documentary proof of citizenship, there are well over 21 million US citizens that don't have or can't easily access a passport or birth certificate or a document that shows their citizenship. And that is about 9% of voters, almost 1 in 10 voters would not be able to provide this documentation. Again, we will definitely send these out so then you can also look at the report in more detail and get more information. But we already know that off the bat, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be impacted. And unfortunately, and no surprise to many of us, there are going to be some groups that are going to be more affected than others. In this next slide here, you will see that there are groups that are less likely to have documentary proof of citizenship. So people of color are 3 times more likely to lack this document than their white counterparts. This is very concerning because we already know that there's a lot of other voter bills that are already negatively impacting people of color. In addition to that, some of the populations that will be more affected, as Edwin had mentioned, married women and other people who may change their names, which in this case, even 5% of men who change their names. Also, voters that live in rural areas will be more affected by this. Young voters as well as low-income individuals. As Edwin had also mentioned, right, tribal citizens, people that would use their tribal ID without any additional documentation would also be greatly affected by this. And then also people that are born in the U.S. territories. And something that I think we can all relate to because of more recent events, voters who have experienced natural disasters and have lost documents along with a lot more would definitely be impacted by this. Next slide. Now that's on a national level, right? But when looking at states, again, we looked at Texas and Georgia. So 7% of Texans and 10% of Georgians lack or do not have a readily accessible documentation showing their proof of citizenship. Again, this is a significant amount when you put it into raw numbers, right? In Georgia, at least 1 in 10 voters don't have it, and Texas isn't that far behind. It also has we had some findings that are not as clear cut, but we thought were interesting. For instance, in Texas, Republicans are more likely to lack access to their documentary proof of citizenship. But in Georgia, political independent individuals are most likely to lack this document. One thing, unfortunately, is across the board nationally in Texas and in Georgia, and that is that young voters are most affected by this, with much higher rates of not actually having documentary proof of citizenship, especially young men. And when it comes to both of these states, which is also a trend that is very similar to the national one, in looking those numbers. Now, again, this presentation will be sent, and so we have included the link here for you to be able to get more information on these studies, and to really dig in and as to the intricacies and a little bit more of what would it mean to certain populations with a documentary proof of citizenship. Now, along with this, we're talking about this quite a bit. And so we wanted to also just really put it into perspective, right? For us, we found that for those people that don't have a driver's license, which is 19%, right? 1 in 5 eligible voters do not have one, which is one of the identifications that are accepted in all of the states that have a voter ID law. They actually identified barriers that included the cost of the license, financial or legal difficulties, not having the time, or not having the underlying documents. Now, you're going to see below the average cost of these documents. We're talking about almost 20% of eligible voters that do not have a driver's license, not having it because of one of the reasons may be cost, which is $40 on average. That is actually the cheapest one if you look at the list of passports and birth certificates that are needed to prove your citizenship, or to have documentary proof of your citizenship. Because as Edwin had said, and this was a popular question, so we'll make sure to answer it at the end, there are only 5 states that will have real IDs that will actually prove your citizenship. The rest, while you're able to use it to actually vote in the on the ballot box, you won't be able to use it to register, and that is without considering transportation to the issuing offices if you do need to be going in person, and also not accounting necessarily through the bureaucratic processes that we have to be able to obtain all of these documents, and also the underlying documents and evidence that you need to be able to receive these. Now, I know that we gave a lot of statistics and numbers, and empirical data is super important, but we also can't forget that this is affecting people, real people in their everyday lives. And so we have a lot of stories of voters who have been struggling, or who are currently struggling even right now as we speak, in trying to get a birth certificate, and trying to get their driver's license or their state ID, trying to get basic documents to be able to get an acceptable voter ID. So if you want to read more of these stories, please go to voteriders.org/SaveActStories to learn a little bit more. And let's not forget, at the end of the day, it's about us. It's about people. And so feel free to go ahead and visit and read a little bit more about that. Now, with that being said, I'd like to introduce Jessica, who will talk to us about her experience through the League of Women Voters on the impact that the SAVE Act could potentially have for people on the ground.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. So nice to be with you, and so nice to see so many League members identify themselves in the chat. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the voter registration impact of the SAVE Act, in particular with some of the systems that we use. Before I talk about specific systems, I want to make sure that we're at a table set here. It is already illegal for non-citizens to register and to vote in federal elections. And every state also bans non-citizens from voting in state elections. Violations can lead to imprisonment, deportation, fines. Like there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't want to risk their immigration status. Voters in every state are also already required to affirm or verify their citizenship status when they are registering to vote. State election officials also have existing systems that they use to verify voter eligibility and ensure accurate voter rolls. There are some municipalities in California, Maryland, and Vermont, as well as the District of Columbia, that allow non-citizens to vote in local elections, but not in state or federal elections. To be clear, there's absolutely no evidence of widespread non-citizen voting in federal or state elections. It's just not happening anywhere in the country. False claims about non-citizens voting in federal elections are a pretext for undermining our access to vote, and they spread misinformation about voting. And we largely believe that these claims are coming from anti-immigrant conspiracy theorists attempting to use fear-mongering and to sow distrust in our democratic process for their own political gain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts on voter registration that the SAVE Act would have. And if we can go to the next slide, I want to just be honest, it would have a chilling effect on voter registration. The SAVE Act, again, would require everyone to provide that documentary proof of citizenship, but it would require a documentary proof of citizenship to be supplied in person. So it would change the way that every single person registers to vote in the country. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about online voter registration. The bill doesn't actually outline anything to do with online voter registration. It doesn't mention it at all, which I think is a problem because we know that 42 states allow citizens to register to vote and to update their voter registration online. It's been a huge priority for the league to implement online voter registration around the country, as well as some of our partners. And we know it works. You can do a lot of stuff online. Why not be able to register to vote or update your registration? But because you're required to provide that information in person, online voter registration systems are not set up to receive information related to documentary proof of citizenship. You still would have to be required to go in person to an election official's office to provide that information. And in 2022, we know that 8 million Americans used online registration systems in that election cycle per the Election Assistance Commission. And the Election Assistance Commission does a great report, and this from the 2022 report. If anybody's interested, I can happy to send it along to you. In addition to that, on the next slide, automatic voter registration would also be impacted. Automatic voter registration is primarily done through DMV services. It is done largely through a bill that the league helped to write, the National Voter Registration Act, Motor Voter, so that whenever you are interacting with a public assistance office, you're given a chance to register to vote, because like, why not? 24 states and the District of Columbia have enacted automatic voter registration processes, and that's as of June 2024. We know that automatic voter registration has greatly improved efficiency of election administration and accuracy in voting rolls. Information is sent directly to the state election administrator's office, but those systems are not set up to collect the information that would be required if the SAVE Act is passed and enacted into law. So you still have to go in person to your election official office and provide the information that this bill requires. And then mail-in voter registration. So I think everyone on this call probably knows that the Election Assistance Commission, which is an independent agency at the federal level, maintains the mail-in voter registration form. You could, under this law, still send in your mail-in voter registration form, but you would, again, still have to go in person to your election official's office and provide your documentary proof of citizenship. The SAVE Act would basically eliminate mail-in voter registration because of the requirement to provide in-person documentation. 3 million Americans registered by email or fax in the 2022 election cycle. So it's not as commonly used as online or automatic voter registration, but it's still very important to voters who maybe live in an area where they don't have, in rural areas where they don't have quite as much access to broadband services, or who live far away from an election office. You heard Selene talk a little bit about the cost of getting to offices to get that documentary proof of citizenship. So this means that, once you even get that information, once you drive there and spend the average of $35 to get to that office, then you would receive your proof of citizenship documentation. And then you would have to drive again to the election official's office to prove that you are a citizen in order to register to vote. And then the next slide, voter registration drives. This is an activity that the League does really well. We are one of the maybe the largest on the ground grassroots organization doing voter registration around the country. It would basically eliminate in-person voter registration activities unless they were really done at the offices of election administrators. It is you're asking volunteers to collect confidential information about citizenship status. I think that people would have a hard time even though the League of Women Voters is a very trustworthy organization, but might have trouble trusting volunteers to take that information. And we also know that some of those documents, like naturalization papers, should not be photocopied. So it would eliminate a lot, if not all, in-person voter registration drives. So I'm not really painting a cheery picture here, which is why we're doing everything we can to try to stop this legislation. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, great. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
Hi, folks. Happy to talk a little bit more about how we expect the SAVE Act, if it were to pass, to impact election administration as well as election administrators themselves. We can move to the next slide. And I'll start talking first about what this means in terms of implementation. How does something like the SAVE Act actually work? And I think the first thing to note here is that the SAVE Act is effective immediately. There's no phase-in period. There's no set time for implementation. And that is, in fact, true even if the SAVE Act is passed right before an election, in the weeks before a voter registration deadline for something major. These changes represent a really major undertaking. As some of the speakers before me have highlighted, a lot of disruption would be expected to the way that states currently run voter registration. And there's going to need to be a lot of new procedure, a lot of new ways that the state has to develop to get voters on the rolls. With no transition period, we are expecting that to happen immediately, which is not going to happen. As one example, Real ID, which changed some of the identity and documentation requirements, has now taken 17 years to implement, and we're still working on it. So expecting everybody to be able to do this overnight is quite a lift. Next, I'll point out that there's no funding mechanism with the SAVE Act. That's a big deal because there would be a lot of things like database upgrades under the SAVE Act, a lot of new types of digital security for storing personally sensitive documents and data. And then also, I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but physical spaces. I mean, let's talk physical spaces for a moment when it comes to election officials. The SAVE Act requires in-person voter registration interactions for agencies that currently are not usually public facing. When you think about what that means on a nuts and bolts level, you often have election officials that are working in a county office or building, maybe housed with other types of county offices, and they do not necessarily have the type of accommodations that you would expect in a public facing government building. Just to think about a few of them, we're talking about public bathrooms, parking spots for everybody, the type of windows and desks that you would normally see if you walk into a public facing agency that would tell you, here's where you stand, here's where you go. None of that infrastructure exists right now, and the SAVE Act requires somebody somewhere to come up with funds to be able to do that for thousands of election administrators across the country. There's also no provision for any kind of training that election officials would have to undergo to authenticate citizenship documents. Thinking back to the type of DMV model, the DMV is one of its core missions is licensing and credentialing. So it does a lot of identity verification. When you are sliding your identity documents across the desk at the DMV official is receiving them and has been trained on how to spot authentic documents, how to spot fakes or forgeries. They have been trained on how to handle those documents physically, how to store them. Those sorts of things are all a core part of their mission. And we would be asking election officials to take on that sort of training, which is it's a full job. But with, again, no provision of resources and no time in which we expect them to do this. It's also an issue that there are no privacy protections that are inherent in the SAVE Act. Again, to go back to the DMV example, that's an agency that is used to handling these types of sensitive documents, and there are a million rules that apply to them, how they can use the documents that they are collecting, where they can store them, how they can release it to the public or other state agencies. All of those sorts of protections are all clearly defined by an array of statutes and regulations at the state level. None of that would be in place for the SAVE Act. And so election officials would be operating in this new environment with a ton of new information and without any of the infrastructure in place to figure out how to do it well. We can move to the next slide. I think in terms of thinking about what election officials themselves are facing, we also, I'll go back to what Caridwen was talking about earlier, where there is a provision in the SAVE Act for folks that don't have the types of identity credentials that are listed. It's intended to be a fail-safe, and it says that voters can still register if they don't have these documents, as long as the election official can fill out some forms, vouch for them, talk about why they think that that person's a citizen. But election officials would have to be pretty bold to take advantage of this provision. This provision is a little bit illusory in practice because election officials under this law would also have the threat of criminal and civil penalties if they register anybody without documents, if they register anybody without sufficient proof, even if non-documentary. And that's true even if the voter that was registered later turns out to have been a United States citizen. Election officials also they've had a tough couple years in terms of litigation, in terms of the type of harassment that they face. And here we would see that the law permits a private right of action against election officials, which means that members of the public can kind of just keep an eye on things, and then they can bring litigation against an election official that they think is not implementing the law correctly or the way that they would want or as strictly as they would want. Going back to my original point about the fact that the act has a remarkably loose set of protocols for election officials to follow about how to store and handle and read these sensitive documents. My assumption is that we would have an awful lot of vigilante litigation that would be placed against election officials. So we would be adding to their docket, their already very full docket of responsibilities, that they would need to be defendants, probably in a decent amount of lawsuits. Also kind of want to reiterate this point, the next point about turning election officials into public-facing agencies. There are real physical concerns about security when it comes to having election offices and election officials themselves in a building that also would need to serve as a public-facing agency. It requires additional staff. Many election officials, there are thousands of election jurisdictions across the country, and many of them are staffed by just one or two people. So imagine if you have a line of people coming in to try to register before the election, they're frustrated. They don't have space to wait. They couldn't find a parking spot. And now suddenly there's only one or two people available to help them. Those are the same people also that have to run the election in a couple days or weeks. You can imagine that it's not a great situation to put members of the public inside of buildings like this with little or no security. Also, the physical buildings that election officials are housed in are often the same physical buildings that are also having access to election equipment, ballot tabulators. Sometimes ballots themselves are stored in the same facility used to house the election officials on a day-to-day basis. So you really would have to figure out some real security protocols to ensure that the public at large doesn't have access to the type of things that are generally not stored in buildings that are intended to be public facing. I can give an example of my own jurisdiction, Maricopa County. In Maricopa County, we have a building that is a central building that has an enormous amount of security that's been unfortunately very necessary over the past couple years. But it means that it is for sure not open to members of the general public. And in order to get in that building, you have to send a series of emails, get credentialed, bring your ID in with you, and be subject to various security checks. And so that would also be something that would have to be, you'd have to think of how to protect election officials physically in a world in which they are being asked to engage directly with the public, as well as protecting that equipment. Lastly, I'd kind of point out that the SAVE Act and transitioning voter registration from a data entry job into an interacting with the public job is just a significant area of new responsibility for election offices that are already under-resourced, often understaffed, and over the past couple years have just been bleeding folks out of the profession. The environment has been really unpleasant over the past couple years, and so people are leaving in large numbers. The idea that they would, under this law, be asked to take on a significant additional source of responsibility, need to figure out how to do new training, get new skills, expose themselves and their equipment to the public and all that comes with it is a way to put them under enormous stress and make the job, frankly, more unpleasant than it is already over the past couple years, and would risk really having more of a brain drain from the election administration profession. With that, sorry that this is pretty dark, but I don't think that there's a lot in here to be excited about for election administration, election officials. But with that, I will throw it back over to Selene.
Thank you, Sarah. So now that you all have learned about voter ID, documentary proof of citizenship, who it's going to affect, what is it, what are its implications, not just on the ground, but also for elections, officials and such, what can we do about it? Right now, with VoteRiders, if we go here to the next slide, you will see that we have developed some material for partners. The first is to tell Congress to stop, reach out to them, whether it's through email, phone, whatever it may be. You can go to voteriders.org/save and you can actually share that out where people can actually fill in their information and reach out to the representatives. We also have a toolkit at voteriders.org/SaveAct toolkit. There, it's a one-stop shop. You will have a one-pager of what is the SAVE Act. You will also have a document where we share some of the voter stories and how people would be impacted by the SAVE Act. It also includes any call to actions that we have, and it also has graphics for social media platforms that you can use so you can help spread the word, and other resources. This is something that we continuously keep up to date, and as it progresses, or should it progress, it will also have the additional or the new calls to action and any other items that we have to share with our partners. You can also go to voteriders.org/save partner toolkit. Again, with these hyperlinks, it will give you just material that it is that you can use to help spread the word, and also material that will also take people into a call to action, whether it's with us or if you're already active in the space and you have your call to action. We just want to make sure that these are being taken advantage of, and that people are really not just knowing what is going on, but also doing something about it, because as Kerwin had said when she was breaking some of those things hands down, right? At first glance, it doesn't look that bad, but when you really read the fine print, you know that a lot of people are in trouble. We're all in trouble. Our democracy is in trouble. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We are now going to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I have some questions here for our panelists. Sarah, we'll have you go up first. One of the questions, as soon as we talked about the real IDs and which ones show citizenship, that was one of the top questions. So if you can talk a little bit more about which states actually prove or have the indication of the citizenship.
Sure. So there are 5 states that currently offer citizen-only licenses. They are called enhanced driver's licenses. And those states are Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Vermont, and Washington. And there's a reason why those are all northern border states. Enhanced driver's licenses also have chips embedded in them that allow a person to drive across a border internationally and use that enhanced driver's license as sort of a passport port of entry through an international border. So we see those 5 states right now that are offering these enhanced license types. And my understanding is that there are other states that are working on offering them as well, or have legislation moving to try to get them available in their state.
Thank you so much for that. Now we have the next question here. Somebody asked, Kansas law, and this is for Jessica from the League of Women Voters. Kansas law was struck down on what grounds? Can similar grounds be used at the federal level as well?
So the Kansas law was struck down, and I know about this because the league challenged the Kansas law. The Kansas law was struck down because it was found to be in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution and the National Voter Registration Act, or the NVRA, also called Motor Voter. The difference between the difference with the SAVE Act is that the SAVE Act is actually amending the National Voter Registration Act. So it's putting documentary proof of citizenship into the NVRA, which would then allow states around the country to move forward with documentary proof of citizenship. Well, actually, it's requiring states, but those laws, like the ones that were in Kansas, the one that's in Arizona that divides the voters, is would be standard around the country.
Thank you for that. And for you again, Jessica, this one is a little bit more of what is going on the ground. But are there any stipulations in the SAVE Act that states that organizations are not allowed to assist people through transportation to the Board of Elections?
There's not anything in the SAVE Act about this, but as most of you probably know, there is legislation across the country and states around the country to limit the way that third-party organizations like the League do voter registration. So it's not in this bill, but there are other movements around the country to try to stop those efforts.
Thank you, Jessica. Sarah, here's another question for you that a few people have asked. So if the documentary requirements in the SAVE Act, would they apply to existing registrations?
It depends on the state. The language on this in the SAVE Act is pretty muddy, but it looks like it applies to new registrations. With that said, the states decide how to process address updates or name changes under state law. In some states, they process that as an update to an existing registration. That would not, I think, be subject to the SAVE Act documentation requirements, but plenty of other states just process address updates and name changes as just a new registration entirely. So in a state that just processes updates to existing registrations as new registrations, I think that most would interpret the SAVE Act to apply to that as well. So in those states, existing registrants would not have to like go back and provide anything if they don't move, but if they make any updates to their voter registration by moving, changing their name, changing their party affiliation, if that's a thing in their state, then the SAVE Act would kick in.
Thank you so much for that. Now there's definitely questions on the processes, or where is the SAVE Act? What is anticipated in the House and the Senate? So would anybody want to speak a little bit about where is it? Where is it anticipated potentially of where it could go, and places where people can maybe take action?
I'm happy to start. I will say that we anticipate this bill to come up in the U.S. House of Representatives at any time. There have already been several times when we have thought they might come up the next week. Usually the leader of the House puts out the floor schedule on a Friday afternoon. So that's when we know what will be on the House floor the following week. So it could come up next week, could come up after the recess. I think probably closer to the end of the month, as the U.S. House will be dealing with a continuing resolution and budgetary funding next week. But I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not sure. So we think it's imminent in the next couple of weeks. As Caridwen said earlier in the presentation, it did pass the House in the 118th Congress. We do believe it will pass the House again in this Congress, and then it will be up to the Senate. Currently, the Senate still has the 60 vote filibuster rule, so would need 60 votes to come to the floor under the current rules. We don't think that the Senate has the votes, but also we don't know. So keep contacting your members of Congress and letting them know how bad this bill would be for the communities that we've already talked about around the country. The League has an action alert. VoteRiders has an action alert. There's a lot of action alerts out there that you can use to contact your members of Congress directly. You can also make a phone call. 202-224-3121, I think, is the House or the Congress's switchboard. So make a call, let them know how you feel, and together we can stop this.
Would anybody else like to elaborate on any of that, of the SAVE Act, where it stands, or anticipated happenings? All right, then we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Just wanted to give enough time in case there was anything anybody wanted to add. So there have been a couple of different versions of this question, and so we think that it might be important to just address it, right? I guess the perception here, right, is to make sure that U.S. citizens are voting. And so is there any numbers or anything that indicate that non-citizens are voting? Is this something that frequently happens? Or what have we seen? Or what data is there out there for that? I'll go ahead, and anybody who wants to speak on that, and it doesn't have to be just one person, if a couple of you want to take that.
I'll start. So I think I said earlier that, non-citizen voting in elections is extremely rare. If non-existent. I think there have been a couple of reported cases, but it was because it was accidental. even the Heritage Foundation, which has tried to find, significant proof that non-citizens are voting, has not been able to uncover, the numbers that the claims started with, after the 2016 election. So it's incredibly rare. There's virtually no proof that this is happening. I want to say that, there are the municipalities that I mentioned that allow for non-citizen voting in local elections, but at the state and federal level, this is not happening.
Thank you for that, Jessica. There was a question regarding how the SAVE Act could potentially, I guess, what implications it would mean for potential voter purges. Are there any thoughts on that from anyone from any of the speakers?
I can speak on that just for a sec and just say that there are not, there's no retroactive element to the SAVE Act. So anybody who is registered would remain registered and you'd be grandfathered into your registration until and unless you register again, which, as I mentioned, in some states, if an existing registrant moves, that's considering registering again. But there's no backward facing element of the SAVE Act. With that said, so there are some questions in the chat about states that are working on state level proof of citizenship legislation. And I'd say that in those states, there's a pretty big difference. I think maybe Corinne mentioned this earlier. There are a lot of different flavors of ice cream when it comes to proof of citizenship laws and how disruptive they are to the current process. SAVE is the most disruptive because it requires this in-person document registration model. There are other state laws that are being proposed right now or discussed that rely more on database verification. This is Arizona's law that's been in place since 2004, largely relies on database verification. Those laws have different sorts of implementation challenges, but I would say in general, these proposals are fairly different. And some of the state level proposals do have retroactive action where people need to go back and provide proof of citizenship, or some of them have the type of audits so that each year the election official is required to go through and do automatic database checks for a certain number of existing registrants. So we're seeing these move in a lot of states. I think as of last count, we were tracking 17 of them, and over 110 bills have been introduced this legislative session nationwide on these types of bills, but they all are pretty different. So the answer about retroactivity and what you need is going to change from state to state pretty widely under the proposals that are currently being discussed.
Thank you. Corinne, would you like to add anything to that?
I was just going to add that, in the 2024 election, we did see an uptick in purges done using really poor citizenship data. And I think that's one thing that there's a risk of, depending on how the state level laws are written. Often states were basically doing a match between the data that folks had provided when they got their ID at the DMV and their voter registration database. And one category of voters who really got caught up in that were naturalized citizens. Because often what happens is folks get their ID at the time that they, enter the country or get their green card or whatever. And then often a driver's license, if you're an adult, often lasts like 10 years. And so they might go through the entire process, naturalize, and then there's no reason to go back to the DMV and update your data. But then if the election officials take the voter registration database and just match it against something like DMV data or some of the other somewhat outdated databases that they have access to on the federal level, often they were incorrectly flagging people as non-citizens who overwhelmingly were eligible US citizens. And if those folks were to get purged in a process like that, and then if we were to have something like SAVE in place, then they of course would have to re-register and would be subject to this requirement.
Thank you so much for that. Now, we had a lot, we answered a lot of the questions. I hope that you found this information helpful. Please know that if there's any questions regarding anything that was covered, or if you want to work together, or just stay up to date, feel free to reach out to us. I do want to thank the League of Women Voters, the Institute for Responsive Governments, and also AAPD RevUp for also providing the ASL and CART services and for participating in this, along with VoteRiders. Thank you so much for joining. Please remember that the recording along with the slide deck will be sent. I did notice that there was somebody who said that one of the links in the slides did not work for them. So we'll make sure that they work before we send it out so you can get all of the information that you're looking for. But again, thank you so much. Know that we will stay up to date. This might not be the last one, but we look forward to staying in touch and just really working together for this. Thank you so much for joining. You have a good rest of your day.